Hello, this is Kylie with Fem and Flow. I hope everyone's having a great day. Today, I want to talk about something I think is keeping so many people stuck in distortion loops without even realizing it. There's a strange obsession right now with villains, with blaming, with hating men, with cancel culture, with making someone else the reason we feel stuck, wronged, or unworthy. There's this almost unconscious compulsion to find the flaw, spot the enemy, and assign the blame. But what if that instinct, the one that's always looking for someone to blame, is actually keeping us trapped in the very distortion we say we want to escape? Because here's the deeper truth, that distortion is not accidental. It's part of the design of the false fourth dimensional arconic grid, a frequency trap built to keep us looping in polarity. The grid thrives on judgment, projection, and moral righteousness. It feeds off the energy generated when we're constantly identifying enemies and staying in opposition. And one of the key tools it uses to reinforce this loop is storytelling. When we're conditioned to think in black and white or binary terms, we become easier to control because the nuance requires self responsibility. But binaries make us predictable, reactive, and easy to manipulate. They shut down inquiry. They cause us to cling to identities and roles rather than evolve. They train us to collapse entire people into one action, one opinion, one perceived flaw. If someone does one thing we don't agree with, we're conditioned to write them off entirely, as if nuance, growth, and multidimensionality don't exist. And that's exactly what the false grid feeds on: predictable loops of blame, guilt, and moral superiority. Movies, shows, and media often program us to expect clear heroes and villains. We're trained to feel uncomfortable with nuance, to crave resolution through blame. We've been fed thousands of narratives where someone must be wrong so someone else can be right. And when life doesn't mirror that simplicity, we get dysregulated. So instead of sitting in discomfort or complexity, we go searching for the familiar script. Who can I blame? Who's the bad guy here? And this is where thought forms come in. The false grid doesn't just influence us through systems, it programs us through narratives. It plants sticky, ready made thought forms into the collective field. Ideas like men are the problem, wealth is evil, if someone hurt you, they're the villain. These aren't just opinions, they're energetic structures, memes in the original sense, that carry a frequency of polarity. And because they're familiar, they're easy to grab onto when we're dysregulated. They give us something to project onto. They give our nervous system something to do instead of feel. They create the illusion of clarity, but really, they trap us in a cycle of reactivity. And this is the trap. When we default to thought forms, we stop thinking for ourselves. We stop asking deeper questions. We unconsciously feed the very distortion we're trying to escape. Because thought forms don't thrive in clarity, they thrive in chaos. They latch on to unresolved pain, binary thinking, and moral superiority. And they spread through the field like wildfire when people are stuck in survival mode, seeking something to blame. And what makes this even more insidious is that some of these low vibe thought forms are repackaged as empowerment. They wear the costume of liberation but carry the frequency of control. Messages like, you don't owe anyone anything, cut them off. If they trigger you, they're toxic. Real queens don't need anyone. And never trust a man. On the surface, it sounds bold, maybe fierce, self loving. But underneath, it's often rooted in unprocessed trauma and fear of vulnerability. It teaches people to isolate instead of connect, to exile instead of understand, and to confuse defensiveness with empowerment. It's not that boundaries aren't sacred, they are. But when empowerment becomes another excuse to avoid intimacy, growth, or reflection, it's not power, it's protection masquerading as power. And the false grid loves that kind of distortion because it keeps people feeling righteous and still deeply alone. So much of the low vibe discourse happening right now isn't just people speaking their truth, it's people unknowingly channeling collective thought forms that were seeded into the field. And like I just said, some of this low vibe discourse is repackaged as empowering, but it's meant to subtly manipulate and control. But here's the key: when you begin to regulate your nervous system, when you step into the role of the observer, you start to notice something stunning. That's not my thought. That's not even my energy. That's just a program I picked up from the collective. And in that moment, the spell breaks. You stop reacting, you stop projecting, and you stop feeding the thought form, and it begins to dissolve. Because thought forms only live if we feed them. Like archons, they have no creative power of their own. They're parasitic frequencies dependent on our connection to source to give them shape, emotion, and momentum. They rely on us, the creators, to generate energy around their idea so it can be made manifest in reality. And that's the twist. They can't exist without us. So when you unplug your attention, stabilize in your field, and choose discernment over reaction, you reclaim your sovereignty. You become unavailable for hijack. You become unfed terrain for distortion. And in that moment, you become undeniably free. So before you collapse into a hot take, a trending opinion, or a reflexive judgment, pause, regulate, and ask, whose thought is this really? That question alone might be the start of your liberation. And maybe the clearest sign that you've stepped out of the false matrix is that it all becomes so obvious. Not from superiority, but from sovereignty. Once your nervous system is no longer hijacked by survival mode, once your mind isn't operating from a threat response, you stop resonating with distortion. You don't have to think your way through it. You just feel that something is off. You see the thought forms. You hear the polarity in conversations. You notice how many people are chasing empowerment that's really just rebranded fear. Your nervous system is no longer constantly scanning for threat, it's scanning for truth. You're anchored in your own tone instead of being pulled into collective chaos. And peace stops feeling like a privilege reserved for the healed. It starts feeling like home, a natural state, a default, the space you make decisions from, not the reward you get at the end. This is the gift of true nervous system healing and stepping out of the system. Clarity becomes your baseline. Discernment becomes effortless. And what used to seduce you into looping, you now see through instantly. So I mentioned that once you heal your nervous system and step out of the false grid, that things become obvious. So here are some examples of things that become obvious that weren't before. That much of what's called empowerment is just reaction wrapped in aesthetic. What's marketed as healing is sometimes looping in disguise. Viral discourse is often just thought form recycling. Same polarity, new packaging. You don't need to fight to feel valid. Peace isn't boring, it's clarity. Discernment feels different than judgment. Boundaries rooted in fear feel brittle. Boundaries rooted in coherence feel clean. So now let's circle back and add perspective because I want to offer you a soft but honest reminder. And this is good for us all to realize and remember. You may be the villain in someone else's story, and they're not wrong. That's just their perspective. Everyone is living through their own lens, their own trauma, their own unmet needs. And in this black hole reality, we've been trained to locate villains instead of hold nuance. We exile instead of inquire, and we glorify the struggle and call it spiritual. And here's the truth. We've all done things we're not proud of. We've done things we might not want others to remember us for. But if we stop and reflect on why we did those things, there's almost always something deeper underneath. Fear, confusion, survival, a need to belong, a trauma response we didn't know how to name at the time. We're actually really good at justifying our own behavior because we know what led to it. We know our context. We understand our pain. But we often don't extend that same compassion to others. We don't pause and ask, what might they have been going through that I can't see? Instead, we collapse someone's character into one moment, one mistake, one shadow, without the same nuance we'd want for ourselves. This doesn't mean we excuse harm. It doesn't mean we abandon boundaries, but it does mean we hold space for complexity. It means we stop turning people into villains just because we're hurt or uncomfortable. We can honor the wound and still hold compassion. We can have boundaries and grace. We can say that wasn't okay without needing to exile someone's entire humanity. And that's the deeper spiritual work, not deciding who's right or wrong, but choosing to be someone who sees beyond the binary. And we also need to start letting go of the narrative that people can't change. People can change if they truly want to. If they're willing to see themselves clearly, take accountability, and do the work to shift their patterns. No, we shouldn't abandon all boundaries or fall for empty apologies. But we also shouldn't write someone off forever based solely on who they used to be. Because I know I'm not the same person I was 5 or 10 years ago. I'm not even the same person I was last year. So why would I assume that no one else can evolve? To embody compassion is to extend the possibility of transformation. To say, you don't have to stay who you were when you were hurting. To believe that people are capable of healing just like you are. We don't have to reconcile with everyone. We don't have to let everyone back in. But we can stop reducing people to their worst moment. We can stop declaring that growth is impossible just because it hasn't happened yet. When we hold space for transformation, not as a guarantee, but as a possibility, we live in alignment with the truth. We are all still becoming. And here's something else to discuss. I mentioned it a little before, but didn't get into it. Not all struggle is sacred. We've been conditioned to believe that if something is hard, it must be holy and worth pursuing. That suffering is the sign we're doing the work. That the more we cry, spiral, or purge, the more evolved we are. But that's black hole spirituality. It's spirituality rooted in distortion, where pain becomes identity and looping becomes a badge of honor. And understanding the 3 paradigm lenses, black hole, bridge, and white hole, makes this clear. In black hole consciousness, you think you're healing because you're constantly in shadow work. But reality, you're just reliving the same wound over and over and calling it depth. In the bridge phase, you start to notice the loop. You still feel the pull to dig and purge, but now you're aware of it. You start asking, is this actually helping me? Or is this a performance of healing I've been programmed into? In white hole consciousness, you don't need to struggle to feel spiritual. You know you're allowed to feel good. You let joy, peace, and clarity guide your evolution, not breakdowns. And this doesn't mean we bypass or ignore pain. It means we stop worshiping it. We stop equating emotional intensity with enlightenment. And we remember real spiritual maturity is the ability to feel fully without identifying with the pain, to evolve without needing to suffer, to spiral out, not deeper in. And this is where we need to differentiate between struggle and initiation. Initiation is a sacred archetype. It's encoded in your soul's journey. But it's not about endless suffering. Initiation is purposeful. It opens you to new dimensions of self-awareness. It rearranges your inner architecture so you can hold more light, more truth, more responsibility. On Earth, it often feels intense, but it always moves you forward. And the difference is this: struggle loops in on itself. It keeps you spiraling in the same emotion, the same identity, the same pain story. It asks, why is this happening to me again? Initiation expands outward. It initiates you into a new frequency of being. It asks, what am I ready to embody now? What am I ready to embody now that I've moved through this? In black hole spirituality, pain is idolized and becomes proof of worth. But in true initiation, especially through the white hole lens, pain is a passage, not a prison. You're not meant to build a house there. You're meant to walk through the threshold and emerge transformed. So we don't need to fear intensity, but we also don't need to call every emotional spiral a spiritual one. When we recognize initiation for what it is, we meet it with reverence, not attachment. And we stop glorifying the struggle that was never meant to define us. And when we let go of the need to struggle to feel worthy, we also start letting go of the need to blame to feel safe. Because those two patterns are woven from the same thread: black hole conditioning. They keep us locked in identity roles, always trying to prove something or protect something instead of simply observing what's true. And that's why so many of us, even in spiritual spaces, still fall into blame, projection, and villain hunting because we haven't yet realized that intensity is not the same as truth and blame is not the same as clarity. I see this happening everywhere right now, especially online. The moment someone's story doesn't align with ours, we label them as the problem: the narcissist, the manipulator, the toxic masculine, the spiritually bypassing feminine. And sometimes, yes, there are distortions. But the deeper distortion is this belief that someone must always be to blame. This is black hole consciousness. It's where duality thrives. It's where we get stuck in the good versus bad binary, always looking for the bad guy so we can feel good again. But in the bridge phase, we start to notice the game. We pause and ask, am I projecting right now? Am I latching onto a role because it makes me feel more in control? This came up recently for me as I was watching the show Sirens. I did a separate TikTok just about this show, but it really made me think about this bigger picture. But online, so many people were obsessed with figuring out who the villain of that show was. Was it the husband? Was it Michaela? Who was right? Who was wrong? But what if no one was the villain? What if everyone was just layered, complex, wounded, and surviving? What if the point of the show wasn't to pick a side, but to notice our own projections? And let's pause here for a second because I want to really be clear about what I mean when I say projection or that something is a mirror. Projection happens when we take something unresolved or unhealed within ourselves, and instead of facing it, we see it out there in someone else. It's not always conscious. It often shows up as being disproportionately reactive to something or someone because it hits an old wound. For example, if someone is extremely triggered by cheating, it may be because they've been cheated on in the past, or they watched a parent cheat, or they themselves carried guilt or shame around emotional betrayal. That wound hasn't been fully processed. So when something happens that resembles it, their system flares up. And instead of just feeling the emotion, they project. That person is the villain. That person is dangerous. That person is wrong. But it's not just about cheating. I use that as an example because I saw something on social media and it brought a lot of discourse about never trusting men and yada yada. This can be almost anything. If someone is constantly annoyed by people who are too confident or too full of themselves, they may actually be disconnected from their own confidence. That person's self expression becomes a mirror, reflecting back what they've suppressed or judged within themselves. If you're deeply triggered by someone being lazy, it might be a mirror showing you your own disowned desire to rest. If someone being loud and expressive irritates you, it might be because your inner child was shamed for being loud, and now you exile that part in others too. Mirrors aren't always pleasant, but they're always instructive. They help us see where we still carry pain, where we still judge, and where we're still seeking control. So when we talk about shows like Sirens being a mirror, it's not just poetic, it's literal. The show reflects our projections. What we see, what we cling to, what we villainize, it all says more about us than it does about the characters. That's the gift and the discomfort of the mirror. But here's where it gets empowering. We can actually use our own projections and triggers to heal. Every time we feel that sharp jolt of reactivity, whether it's judgment, disgust, fear, or rage, that's not just discomfort. It's a signal. It's a little flag rising that says, there's something deeper here, something I haven't yet explored. Instead of spiraling into blame or retreat, we can pause and ask, what is this really about for me? What old wound or unmet need is being stirred right now? This kind of awareness doesn't mean we suppress our feelings. It means we get curious about them. We let them guide us inward instead of projecting them outward. And just as we're learning to extend this nuance and compassion to others, we also need to remember it when negativity is directed toward us. When someone lashes out, judges you, misunderstands you, or assigns you a role in their story that doesn't feel true, just remember it's probably not about you at all. Most of the time, it's a projection, an old wound being activated, a thought form they've picked up and attached to your face, a frequency mismatch that feels like threat when really it's just unfamiliar resonance. You don't have to take it personally. You don't have to fix it. And you definitely don't have to shrink yourself in response to it. Instead, you can pause, ground, and remember, this is not mine to carry. That's how we stay sovereign in the face of distortion. not by fighting, but by refusing to participate. When it comes to all of these negative or confusing feelings that can arise when someone unconsciously projects onto others or latches onto thought forms, for many people, the truth is they don't even know what they're supposed to feel. They've been operating in fight or flight for so long that neutrality or peace feels foreign. That's where nervous system regulation comes in. When our system is dysregulated, everything feels like a threat. But when we begin to co regulate with safety, whether through breath, somatic presence, or gentle inquiry, we create space for clarity. And it's important to name this too. The false matrix is designed to keep us in fight or flight. It thrives on chronic stress, urgency, fear, and pressure. It keeps people in survival mode so they're easier to control, easier to manipulate, and too exhausted to ask deeper questions. It keeps the nervous system overstimulated through nonstop media, digital noise, fear cycles, and performance driven culture. It glorifies busyness and burnout. It equates rest with laziness. It distorts our internal compass so we mistake anxiety for ambition and numbness for peace. When you're in survival mode, your body isn't concerned with truth, nuance, or growth. It's only concerned with getting through the next moment. And when that becomes the norm, we lose access to our higher intelligence, our intuition, our ability to discern, and our capacity for compassion. This is why nervous system regulation isn't just a wellness practice. It's a form of liberation. When we regulate, we reclaim the ability to feel clearly, choose consciously, and actually respond instead of react. And that's when the projections begin to dissolve. The truth is, the false matrix system is set up to keep us in survival mode. It's not just theory, it's design. They want us working 9 to 5 jobs, exhausted, compliant, and too depleted to question the system. They want us chronically worried about losing healthcare, affording rent, or keeping up with the endless grind. Because when we're in survival mode, we're easier to manipulate. We stay in fear. We don't have space to dream, regulate, or remember who we really are. But I've talked before about how we escape this trap, and it's by exploiting the paradox. The Matrix wants us to believe that the only way to be safe is to stay in the very systems that are draining us. But the moment we regulate our nervous systems, everything changes. We access a different level of perception, one where we're no longer bound by fear, but guided by resonance. So let's go back to what I've shared in past episodes. Our emotions carry unique frequencies. And those emotional frequencies don't just stay in our bodies, they radiate outward. They're how we create our reality. When our nervous systems are dysregulated, we are constantly reacting. We are triggered. We spiral. We send out low frequency waves like hate, shame, fear, and those waves go into the quantum field, which is full of endless strings of vibrating energy. And because like attracts like, those waves collapse into particles that match their frequency. That's what gets pulled back into our field through the toroidal flow of our energy body. So if you're constantly reacting, constantly angry, constantly blaming, guess what? You're attracting more of that energy, not as punishment, but as feedback. But with a regulated nervous system, you become the observer. Thoughts no longer immediately equal emotion. You can witness a thought, hold space for it, and choose your frequency. And that changes everything. This is how we exit survival. This is how we collapse the false matrix, not by fighting it, but by exploiting the paradox, by realizing we don't have to play by its rules, by choosing regulation, emotional sovereignty, and quantum awareness. That's how we become free. And the first step is understanding the actual quantum physics behind all of this. So it's not just some abstract spiritual concept, but a grounded reality. When we talk about creating our own reality, we're not talking about wishful thinking. We're talking about quantum law. We're talking about how vibrational frequency influences wave collapse and how the energy we emit literally sculpts the architecture of our lived experience. From there, we heal the nervous system because a dysregulated body cannot hold higher frequencies consistently. And then we do the inner work, the real work, the often uncomfortable work of becoming radically self-aware and honest with ourselves. Where am I still clear? Where am I still carrying blame? Where am I still outsourcing power? What am I refusing to feel? We start noticing the loops, the projections, the contradictions, and we lovingly, steadily begin to release because we can't fake our frequency and we can't bypass the work, but we can meet it with grace and let it carry us into a new timeline. And I mentioned that we need to have radical self-awareness, but self-awareness doesn't always have to be radical, and it definitely shouldn't be performative. It can be soft, gentle, a quiet noticing. Why did that bother me? What part of me flinched? What part of me wants to be seen right now? This is how we use mirrors consciously. This is how we stop outsourcing our power to projections and start reclaiming the parts of us that have been exiled. It's not about being perfect. It's about being honest and willing to see what's underneath the surface. That's white hole consciousness. It doesn't need to win the narrative. It doesn't need to be right. It just watches, it sees the energy, it holds the nuance, it notices the trauma. And then it asks, which frequency do I want to live from now? And when you reach white hole frequency, you stop trying to win. You stop glorifying the struggle. You stop blaming men, blaming women, blaming the world. And you realize there's no villain, only mirrors. The distortion also becomes obvious. You see through the thought forms that were planted to keep people looping in the system of control. And that's where the spiral finally ends. Not with a plot twist, but with peace. And from that peace, we can begin to see clearly, even in the spaces where collective emotion is intense. Take the current wave of hating men or down with the patriarchy discourse. There's so much unprocessed trauma there, and it's understandable. Many women have been deeply hurt, silenced, abused, or ignored within patriarchal structures. But we need to add nuance here. The patriarchy wasn't created by men as a collective gender. It was engineered intentionally by the dark global elite as part of a broader control grid. A system that distorts both masculine and feminine energy. Yes, men have enacted harm under that system, but they've also been deeply harmed by it, disconnected from emotion, pushed into provider roles, shamed out of sensitivity, blamed for a system they didn't create. If we can understand that, we can begin to release the blame. We can stop projecting onto men what was never theirs to hold alone. And we can stop confusing power with oppression. And to flip the mirror, think about the way society talks about women, especially online. There's a constant policing of femininity. Too loud, too sexy, too much, too shallow, too soft. Women are told to speak up, but not too much. Be visible, but not too visible. It's a no win game. And we see this same binary logic repeated again and again and again. We see it everywhere. It feels like no matter what you do, you cannot win. And another place I've been seeing this recently online is this logic getting applied to influencers. People love to hate them. People say they're performative, shallow, materialistic. But here's the other side of the story. Many influencers are carving out paths of creative freedom. They're doing what they love. They're working from home, building communities, sharing what they're passionate about, and making real money doing it. Isn't that what we all say we want? Why is it more respectable to work for a corporation selling someone else's vision than to market for a brand you love on your own terms? Why is the office grind noble but online influence shameful? Again, it's the same distortion, the same binary, the same projections. And like I said, I use those as examples because I've been seeing that hate and negativity around those a lot recently. But seriously, in a polarized system, no one can win. Everyone becomes a target. But when we drop out of the blame loops, we start to see people as people, complex, flawed, expressive, layered. And we stop exiling the very freedoms we say we want for ourselves. So, as we move forward, can we hold more nuance? Can we pause before labeling someone a villain? Can we look at the thought forms we're participating in? Can we stay curious instead of reactive? That's how we stop feeding distortion and start living in truth. So that's all I have for today. I hope you like this episode. I love you all and have a great day.